Welcome back to Philosophy for Flourishing, the show where we explore principles and practices for living the best, most fulfilled life possible. Today, the show, we might call it something like John and Jackson. This is like a new segment that I want to do on this show with my friend Jackson, who is relatively new to philosophy, or perhaps relatively new to the philosophy of objectivism, and is interested in philosophic questions and how they apply to living a good life. So I invited him on the show just so we could have a good conversation about some of the questions that he has. And I think we'll try to take them one at a time just to keep these episodes relatively bite-sized and manageable, but we'll sort of let that one question bleed out into other related questions as they come up. So welcome to the show, Jackson. Thanks so much for being on.
Thank you, John. I appreciate the opportunity to get to talk to you about these questions.
Excellent. So let's dive in. What is on your mind?
So this question, I've been thinking about it for a while now, probably since I first got introduced to Ayn Rand's concept of value. And the question is, do we choose or discover the reasons behind our values? So, for example, I'm really into weightlifting. Like, it's very fun. I get endorphins from, or the endorphin, like that. The good positive feelings you get after working out, and you get to build muscle. So there's a lot of benefits associated with it. But I also just like the act of working out. Like, I like lifting heavy things, and I don't know why. It's kind of like just a fact of my nature. So in that sense, I kind of just discovered that interest. I didn't really choose it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you recall Rand's discussion of value and what she ultimately says values are?
Something you act to gain or keep.
Mm-hmm. So it's a very broad definition that applies to anything. It could be that you value a relationship with God, so to speak, and so you pray. It could be that you value playing in a band like I do, and see my guitars in the background here, and that you act to gain and keep that. So it's a very broad definition that covers anything that someone acts to gain or keep. But there's another step in her definition of value. There's another place that she goes with this, and it's really the basic premise of her entire ethical view. Do you recall what that is?
Not specifically. Can you elaborate?
Yeah. So Rand talks about, why do we need this concept of value at all? What facts of reality give rise to the need of this concept of value? And, she talks about how values are dependent on the alternative of life and death. If there is nothing that is living, then there can be nothing that acts to gain or keep values. A rock, for instance, doesn't act to gain or keep any values. My house does not act to gain or keep values, but living things do. Plants act to gain or keep nutrients. They shoot roots down into the soil and grow out toward the sun and absorb nutrients and water. Animals act to gain or keep food. Squirrels in my yard. Actually saw turkeys out in my yard this morning, looking around for worms and whatever it is they eat. Squirrels out there unburying their acorns. And then us, we're here acting to gain or keep values as well. We have different values because we have a conceptual consciousness. We're able to gain abstract values in the form of knowledge that we can then use to act on and improve our lives. So values are dependent on life. And, if you die, then there goes your capacity to value anything. You can no longer value things. So philosophy, and Rand's philosophy in particular, tells us that values are legitimate. Values are things that serve our lives. They are values insofar as they promote our lives and our happiness and our flourishing. And the things that don't do that, the things that actually keep us from living good lives, are disvalues. In her more thought out and mature sense of the term value, there's sort of an added layer of meaning to it. So at the basic level, the level that everyone can agree on, it's that a value is something that you act to gain and or keep. and more thoroughly, once you've really chewed what that means and where the concept of values comes from, there's an added layer, which is that values are those things that actually promote our lives. And weightlifting, conversations like this, music, there are all sorts of things that promote a happy and flourishing life, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of the other things that that you value and are pursuing in your life?
Are you referring to optional values or universal values?
Just anything in general. Like what are you working on in life that you're trying to pursue and to achieve?
Well, I've been really focused on growing my personal brand in the past few months and trying to increase my following on Twitter to build an audience to eventually market products to in the future. So I have a bit of an entrepreneurial bent in me.
Mhm.
So I value that. I also have recently, on and off, I haven't been as consistent as I'd like, but I've been trying to learn piano.
Nice.
Yeah. For whatever reason, I wasn't super. I was into singing as a kid, never into playing instruments.
Mhm.
So it's something that's been on my mind for the past few years now.
That's great. I got
Um,
for my wife for Christmas, I got her a subscription to Artist Works for pop piano lessons, and she's been doing it and loving it, by the way.
oh,
So,
nice.
so you're after a lot of things, and all of us are. Like, we need values in order to live our lives. We need, there are broad values that we all need, like food, water, shelter, good relationships. It's hard to have a good life without good relationships, friendships, romantic relationships. And basically what philosophy tells us is that the values are things that promote our happiness and our flourishing, and the things that don't are non-values, and we ought to avoid those things. And it tells us, to act on our reason to gain these values, learn about reality, learn about the cause and effect relationships that bring about the values that we want in our lives. It tells us about some high level abstract values like using reason, which we just mentioned, being honest, not trying to fake reality and gain values on the basis of falsehoods, having integrity to rational values, judging men rationally based on their actual actions and ideas. So lots of broad abstract values that it tells us about, including productivity, reorganizing the things that exist in the world in order to put them into useful, valuable things that will help us achieve our ends. Or we rearrange the materials of existence to create the values on which our lives depend. So productivity, this is a broad one. But it doesn't, the purpose of philosophy is not to prescribe, or at least the legitimate philosophy is not to prescribe to us the minutia of our day-to-day lives. It's to give us broad based guidance about what things to pursue. And that's what it can do. It can tell us to pursue life-serving values. What in fact is a life-serving value? Well, philosophy is the ground from which the special sciences grow. And so if we adopt philosophical conclusions that are erroneous, it's going to lead us astray in figuring out those more specific questions of what things are of value that we should pursue. If, for instance, we adopt something like an intrinsic code of values, if we take, for instance, Plato's theory of the form of the good, Plato held that there is some the good. There's a form of the good that exists in this alternate universe independent of this one. There's a perfect form out there. It's sort of like a paradigm form of the good, and all things that are good in this life partake or reflect that form in some sense. And if we think that, we might go down the track of, when we get to these more basic questions of what should I do with my life, how should I spend my time, we might latch on to some ideas like, the passion hypothesis, or the one true calling idea. I take this in reference to Cal Newport's book, So Good They Can Ignore You, which I know you're a fan of. So, if you think that there's like one true good thing out there, it's intrinsic in the universe, it doesn't depend on your context or your values, it just is, then you might think, well, philosophy is something that should prescribe what that thing is and do so without reference to me, the valuer, and the things that I actually care about. But legitimate philosophy or a rational philosophy, if you accept the idea that values are things that you act to gain or keep to enhance your life, then that all of a sudden no longer feels like a straitjacket that's telling you, okay, you ought to pursue weightlifting, or you ought to make X amount of money, you ought to spend this much time doing X. You mentioned earlier this idea of optional values, and that's exactly where we're going with this conversation. Is there are all sorts of optional values in life. So there are plenty of things that promote and support your life. So philosophy tells us you need to be productive. You need to create the values on which your life depends. But it doesn't tell you whether you should go out and start finding Twitter followers and try to become an entrepreneur, or rather to start a band and try to win a Grammy, or to become some sort of successful real estate agent. It doesn't prescribe to us the specifics. It just says that we ought to pursue life-serving values. And that's all it really can do. But what it ought to do is a rational philosophy, one based on the facts of reality, ought to integrate with the other special sciences that give us more knowledge on these subjects. So, we just brought up Cal Newport's book, So Good They Can't Ignore You. There's so much great work out there in the self-development sphere that if you are, wondering, okay, well, how should I spend my time? What should I do? What should I work on? There are all these optional values, and I don't know which ones to choose. Well, rational philosophy is going to integrate really well with rational self-development philosophy. And really, I think, at a certain level, we can make this distinction that philosophy is just giving us these broad abstractions, and then the special sciences are doing some of the heavy lifting and the more nuanced and specific questions. But, there's almost not a real division there. And there doesn't really need to be a division in one's mind. Like, you can integrate all of these ideas into a coherent system. And so getting back to, optional values, you might prefer chicken over beef, right? But the fact that you need to eat food and not poison is non-negotiable. It's not optional. Within the realm of things that you can eat to preserve your life, there's a whole bunch of options. Within the realm of life-serving careers, there's a whole bunch of options. And really, the most that objectivism tells us on this question is that you ought to choose something that uses your fullest potential, that really taxes your mind, and that keeps you growing, keeps you learning. And I love, like I said a minute ago, this stuff dovetails really nicely with the special sciences that give us insight on this field. I remember reading when I was 17, I read Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's book Flow, and I saw this beautiful correlation. There's the beautiful connection there. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi is talking about this phenomenon in psychology called flow. When you're working at your highest potential, you're sort of just like at the cusp of almost not being able to perform at a high enough level, but you just barely can, and it like keeps you fully engaged. And we experience this flow state in all sorts of different things that we can do, and we can cultivate it in different ways as well. So you might start out not actually liking weightlifting, right? You might go to the gym and be like, yeah, this isn't that great. But then, you sort of gain an understanding of what values are at stake here, what values are possible to achieve. You gain some knowledge about that. And then, all of a sudden you start waking up to the possibilities of the opportunities for achievement in this field. And you start taking more pride in it, start getting more emotional rewards from it. And there's this like nice reciprocal spiral effect that happens, and it happens in all sorts of ways. So, optional values, like, should you weightlift? Well, Yeah, I mean, it's certainly within the sphere of life-serving values. Physical fitness is key to, I think physical fitness is key to happiness. And we're beings of both mind and body, and if we spend all our time just developing our minds without thought of how we feel in our bodies and what we look like, chances are we're not going to be very happy, because we're going to sort of fall into the sweatpants routine and not really caring about what we eat and all that stuff. And it's going to affect how we're thinking and what we're doing with the rest of our lives. So I think it's a great optional value. And I lift myself and really enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. There's also an interesting connection between the body and the mind, in that there's a bit of a synergistic effect. By improving one of them, you're in a sense improving the other. So for example, by working out, there's a ton of health benefits associated with that, and a ton of cognitive benefits associated with that. So that's going to impact your ability to think and to pursue values related to thinking. Vice versa, if you get better at thinking, you can make better decisions with regards to your health. So they kind of build upon each other. A bit of a tangent, I guess.
Absolutely true, though. I know you and I are both really big fans of Andrew Huberman's podcast.
Oh my God, it's amazing.
And he's constantly highlighting the connections between mind and body. I mean, he's not explicitly setting out to do, I guess to a certain extent he is, because he's talking about your efficiency and how to have a great daily routine. And he's talking about things you can do physically, like get out for a walk in the morning, get sunlight in your eyes, have what he calls optical flow. He uses all these scientific terms for really basic things like taking a walk, but I love it. And it's absolutely the case that these things have reciprocal effects. And so it's really important. Actually, it's almost not even just an optional value. I mean, weightlifting specifically, but some form of exercise is quite necessary to live a good life.
Right. Agreed. I still do have I'm still not sure exactly though how we do choose our optional values. Like, of course, like we use our free will, and like I understand the mechanism, but I think a lot of young people today, given that there's so much information out there about all these different things they could pursue, especially with career, see this a lot with young people, is that they have no idea what to do or which route to go in. So they just end up doing nothing. Mm-hmm. And I guess my question to you is, does philosophy provide, you might have answered this earlier, does philosophy provide a good framework for choosing the specific values? Is there anything we can get from philosophy to help us answer that question?
Yeah, I think the most relevant philosophic principle is do the thing that requires the most of you. Pick your most exciting and ambitious project. This is the way that Blake Scholl, who's the CEO and founder of Boom Supersonic, put it. He said, pick the thing that is most exciting and most ambitious. And I think that's just a brilliant way of putting it, because it's, okay, what field am I going to be working in? What projects and what questions am I going to be tackling that requires me to operate at my personal red line? My personal red line, this is the most that I can push myself to do. This is where I'm going to feel most fulfilled. So this is still very broad, right? And this is why we need the special sciences. Philosophy can't do everything. It is confined to telling us about the most general aspects of man, of existence, and man's relationship to existence. So it doesn't really get more specific than that, but it does tell us to use our reason. And when we do, I think that points us in the direction of psychology and the sort of personal development, career development ideas that are based on reason. And so, to bring up Cal Newport again, his book, So Good They Can't Ignore You, is one of the absolute best for answering this question, because the common idea that we hear is follow your passion. And he debunks this idea completely. Follow your passion is really bad advice, he shows, because a lot of people don't have passions, or their passions are fleeting. They start working in a field and realize, well, this sort of emotional idea that sort of a emotional undertone that I had to what this might be is not actually true. It doesn't actually work. Like, I started doing it and it doesn't actually live up to the image that I had in my mind. And so Cal's advice is to look out at the world and look see where you can develop career capital. And to do this, so we'll talk about what career capital is in a minute, but to do this, you have to be reality oriented. You have to go out and try things, figure out what you're interested in, give them a shot, talk to people who work in the field, see what kind of career trajectories that they've had. Look for models, look for people whose careers that you really admire and might like to have something similar to that. Mm-hmm. Then build up career capital being this, well, capital that you can use. It's this value because you've gained skills that are rare and valuable. You have these rare and valuable skills that you can put to work creating value for other people. And passion or mission, these things develop over time. So we talked earlier about flow and how there's this sort of reciprocal effect between, working out, for instance, in your case, and gaining more confidence and more knowledge of the opportunities. Well, he talks about getting to the edge of the known in a given field and seeing this just incredible range of opportunities that are out there waiting for somebody to achieve. And so I think that if you take Cal's advice and you develop career capital and you don't discount, this is, I think, where a lot of people get hung up is they think, well, especially if they're familiar with objectivism, they think, well, emotions are not tools of cognition. Ergo, the thing that I feel strongly about is not something that I should do. And this is where the passion, don't follow your passion advice could be, I think, misconstrued. It's not that you don't follow the things that you have some interest in. Interests are hard. It's hard to tease out why we're interested in the things that we're interested in. Some of them are things that for, some reason we were exposed to something in our childhood that we've long forgot about. And we don't exactly know why it is we have, for me, an inherent interest in music, but I have that interest and I like pursuing musical projects. I don't know exactly why I like writing and why I like philosophy, but the key is there a reason to do this? Is there a rational basis to do this? And what is my reason for doing this? So morality doesn't say, well, you can't care about your emotions. Emotions are not primaries. They're not tools of cognition, but they do help us understand and experience our lives in reality. So if we have a positive emotion to something, that's a sign that we ought to investigate that further and to ask questions about why we have that emotion, whether or not that is a rational response. And if it is, and if it's it's an optional value within the realm of life-serving values, there's no reason that you shouldn't pursue it further. I love the advice, I know you're familiar with it, that Isaac Morehouse gives. Don't do stuff you hate. And he's talking about this from sort of the opposite side. We're talking about, in the things that you're interested in. You have some interest, some, passion, if you will, just some attraction to. So we're talking about, go out into the world, experience those things, experiment, figure out if you can create value that other people are willing to pay you for. And he's talking about don't do stuff you hate, which is really, it's just, they're coming to the same question from opposite sides. Don't do stuff you hate is, well, there's all the stuff that you do hate. Well, you probably don't want to, pursue a career doing that stuff. So set it aside. But then there's all this stuff that you might enjoy that you don't even know yet. So go start trying things, go take advantage of opportunities that are available to you. Go job shadow people that, maybe there's a dentist's office down the street and you're really interested in dentistry. Well, go there for, a day or two, like call the doctor and say, hey, I'm interested, but I'm not sure if I want to dive in and splurge on all the schooling that I'll need just yet. Do you mind if I just sort of like get some ideas about how this would work? And then maybe you find out after a week that you do hate that, like it's not interesting to you. So you move on, but you're sort of chiseling away at all the options that are out there. And your emotions in that process ought to be things that you investigate. You don't just say, well, I hate this, ergo I shouldn't pursue it. It should be, well, why? What didn't I like about it? Perhaps I'm really not big on big government, and I don't like the idea that I have to spend hours and hours on medical billing. and worrying about what insurance companies will and will not cover. So maybe, that's a good reason. That's a legitimate reason. But if it's, well, I don't know, it just struck me the wrong way, like the doctor didn't have the right personality or something like that, you're going to go astray really quickly, because you're going to be making decisions on superficial feelings and superficial data instead of good reasons. So use your emotions to help guide you in the right direction, but use them properly by investigating them, finding out whether or not they're based on rational, good reasons. And if they're not, then they're going to lead you astray.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of funny. I made this mistake in college. So for context for the viewer, I went to university last year. So it was my freshman year, and I decided to take a gap year after that for a variety of reasons. But I went to enter academia. I was interested in science as a kid and in high school. So I was like, okay, this is an interest and I'm going to pursue it. The issue is I spent a lot of money to do that by going to college, when there were probably cheaper and more efficient alternatives, like shadowing maybe someone at your local clinic who's doing research to get an idea. Because what happened was, this summer I had a job at a lab, and it was very different from the picture I had in my mind. There's a big disconnect between the two, and I ended up really not liking the work. So in a sense, I could have saved a lot of time if I had done what you had said, instead of just, pursuing this quote unquote passion without actually doing the due diligence to interview people in the field and get cheap and effective experience early, rather than spending a bunch of money.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and what philosophy tells us in this regard, again, is use your reason and look for work that enables you to, use your mind to its fullest extent. You might not be able to do that right out of the gate. Right. And so I think a lot of people also have an experience like you did, but then they write off an entire field, and it's very easy to overgeneralize from one experience, which is another reason it's so important to investigate your emotions rationally. It's okay, well, was my experience about work in sciences in general, or was it about this specific company? Was it about the boss that I had? Relationships have an amazing, just huge impact on whether or not we like our jobs. So it's really important to investigate further and figure out, okay, well, what aspect of it was it that really turned me off? And perhaps it doesn't redirect me into a whole nother field. Perhaps it just, gives me, cuts off a part of this field, and it helps me get more specific about what it is I'd actually like. And I think that this is, that chiseling analogy, I really like it, because this is really how it works, is like you have a hypothesis. And if you're acting on reason, if you're using philosophy correctly, you have this hypothesis, and then you want to go out into the world and test it. Reality is going to give you the evidence upon which to make decisions. It's not as if you can just turn inward and say, okay, well, what is the one perfect career for me? What's my one true calling? What's my inbuilt passion? What was I born with? What was I born to do? No, you have this hypothesis, and you go out into the world and you test it. And over time, you refine, you edit down, and you get more and more specific about what it is that you like. And while you're doing that, you're gaining experience, you're gaining career capital, you're gaining the ability to have more control over what it is you want to do. And so these two processes go hand in hand, and that you can't do them effectively without you can't do them effectively if you discard the information of your emotions altogether, and you can't do them effectively if you just take your emotions at face value and don't think critically about why you feel the way you feel about things.
Mm-hmm. A question that came up while you were discussing that is, discussing that, why do you think so many people have this idea that there is one like calling or purpose that they need to follow? Why do you think that's baked into so many people, the idea?
Yeah, I think that Cal talks a bit about this in his book. So I defer, for more discussion on this, I'd defer people there. He talked about how this became a fad in the intellectual world in the 90s. And I don't know exactly why that is. I don't recall if he says. It's perhaps goes back to all the way back to ancient Greece, to these ideas of there being, one potential that you're put on this earth to fulfill. It's hard to say, with any irrational idea, um, you know, often there are seeds of what might seem like plausible reasons for this thing to be true. And in this case, there are some of those. It's clear that some people are better at certain things than others. They have a greater aptitude for developing business relationships. And so they just are more interested in that, and they go into that field. Also, there is this sort of hindsight is 2020 thing where people build this incredible career, and at the end of it, they're like, yeah, this was like always my passion, and I just sort of uncovered it. And then I just pursued this one thing for like 20 years. But if you were actually like look at their trajectory more minutely, you'd see all these sort of decision points where they're really actually doing what we're talking about, which is refining a hypothesis over time and getting closer and closer to that thing. So it's hard to say exactly why. But I think that Cal brings it, he brings it back to a specific paper or book that was written in the 90s that then was proliferated out in a bunch of other work done by other academics and even pop writers. And then this began to be taught in schools. And so, now we've had generations of kids that are exposed to this idea fairly young. And then they have this pressure, the psychological pressure that they feel to figure out, what is my passion? What's my one true calling? How do I uncover that one thing that I'm supposed to do? Maybe I have to go on this, trek across Europe or something and backpack across Europe and have like these certain life experiences to just uncover that thing. And then that's the thing I'm going to do for the rest of my life. It's a sad fact that it is the case. I'm not exactly sure what accounts for it, but it's there.
Yeah, I haven't actually read So Good They Can't Ignore You. I've only read Deep Work from Cal's books. So I'll have to take a look into that.
It's excellent. One of my favorites.
So earlier you were talking about how life is the standard of value, and actions which improve your life are good for your life, and actions that harm your life are not good for your life, and are morally wrong. So I was wondering if I could, try to explain why that is the case to you, to see if there's any holes in my thinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So for my understanding of my very brief understanding of objectivism, this is the reason why life is the standard of value. So the whole purpose and the whole reason we have morality is because we're alive. Only living things can make decisions and can act. So that's the only reason why we need morality. So from that, also, living things have to act in order to live. So there's two parts to this. One, only living things can act, and two, living things have to act in order to live. Mm-hmm. So from that, based on that assessment, the actions which improve your life, sustain or further your life, are therefore moral, because that's the only reason why we have morality. And on the contrary, the actions that harm your life or hinder it are immoral. Mm. Is that accurate or correct? Are there any issues with that that assessment?
Well, I would point out that morality and the standard of value are actually at sort of different levels in philosophy, because the standard of value actually applies to all living things, even those living things that cannot choose their actions, and so don't need a code of values upon which to choose their actions. So it's true for the flower, for instance, that its life is its standard of value. It doesn't have thought. It can't formulate these concepts, these principles that we're talking about here. But it's nonetheless true that a certain amount of sunlight or a certain amount of cold air can harm it. And the concept of harm depends logically on this concept of its own life. Its life, the fact that it is alive, is what makes certain things good or bad for it. And so the concept of value depends on a valuer and a goal. And the goal for all living things, the most fundamental goal, is survival. More than that, living things seek not only to survive, but to thrive. But you cannot achieve any value if you're not first alive. So values presuppose a valuer, and a valuer is something that is alive. A rock doesn't value anything. My house doesn't value anything. And so the standard of value is actually a sort of pre-moral principle. And it's just a general fact about the world that if you look out at existence, you see that the good for any organism is that which promotes its life. Morality is specific to organisms that have the ability to think conceptually, to choose their actions. So we have free will and conceptual consciousness. And what that enables us to do is, just as in physics, for instance, we can derive principles from the facts of reality to understand things like the law of gravity. And then we can use principles of physics to achieve our ends, say building a bridge or building a house. Well, just as we can do that in physics, we can do that in other fields. We can do that in the field of ethics. We can look for principles upon which we should act in every single case, universal principles that can help us achieve our goals. Our goal in this case being living and flourishing. And so we need a code of values so that we can consistently act in our own self-interest. And that's where morality comes in. I love the analogy that Leonard Peikoff gives in his book, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. He says something to the effect of philosophy, or morality more specifically, is the instruction manual for living a good life with which man did not come. And that's not an exact quote, that's a paraphrase, but it is that. It's sort of like an instruction manual for living a good life. And if you don't have the manual and you're just going by the seat of your pants, it's going to be much, much harder to achieve a good life. And so it's in our best interest. The reason that we need morality is to survive and thrive. And we do so by gaining values that enhance our life being the standard of value. So does that kind of tie it all back together for you?
Yeah, that does bring up another question for me. And it's, where does reproduction fit into that in terms of life being the standard of value? Because a lot of animals, or life in general, will at times pursue reproduction above its own life. Those are probably the edge cases, but I think you could bring up a few examples of that. Is it just that life is more fundamental than, or a more fundamental goal than reproduction?
Well, if we're talking about human beings, then this goes back to optional values. Mm-hmm. It's completely optional whether or not you want to have kids. And, you might have grown up with really strong family relationships, and so have developed an affinity for children early on, and sort of saw your own self being in that role one day of helping cultivate valuers, independent thinking, and just helping young people sort of tackle the job that is living. So I would regard reproduction as just merely an optional value. It's obviously of prime importance for a species to continue going on existing, but thankfully, biologically built in, we have predispositions to most of us, at least, to want to reproduce. And so it's not so much some difficult task that we have to think about where to, how to do this. It's, well, do I want to have kids or not? How does that fit in with the rest of my values? Does that help?
It does, but what if we're talking specifically animals besides humans, or organisms besides humans? Because I guess the general gist of the question is, so organisms will pursue goals or values that enhance or improve their life. They will also pursue values in order to reproduce as a really major goal. And I think there might be times where the organism will pursue the values related to reproduction over their own life. Like it's biologically baked into them to reproduce. So I'm trying to figure out where that fits in with life being the standard of value. Does that make sense?
Could you give an example
Example of what?
of an animal pursuing reproduction over its own life?
I can't think of a very, very specific case.
Let me take a stab then with an example on the table. Evolution has baked into most animals, I think probably all animals, this desire to reproduce. And it's done so via the pleasure-pain mechanism. Organisms pursue things that are pleasurable, and they don't have the ability to think long range like man does. This is why for us, reproduction is an option. It's not something that we are programmed and we have to do. We can decide to have sex wearing a condom. And so this is for animals, something that is baked into them and something that they pursue based on this pleasure pain mechanism. And so there's no shoulds about it. There's no real choice about it. It's that they are acting on their instincts, on the information that they have available to them at that moment, and pursuing pleasure, which is what they often do. This is sort of a basic built-in mechanism for animals to pursue their lives. So I think that biologically, evolution has latched onto this pleasure pain mechanism to ensure that animals do reproduce. And so we're just talking about, the fact that there's this connection here, this unbreakable connection for most animals between pleasure and life. And pain is a sign that an organism is doing something that is against their life, that is life destroying. And so these two things go hand in hand in the animal world outside of human species and even within, but we're talking here about animals. Biology, evolution has co-opted the pleasure pain mechanism and used it to, obviously it doesn't have its own intentions, but what it has in fact done is found a way to ensure that life goes on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense.
Great. Well, this has been a really fun conversation, and I know that you have a bunch more questions, and we'll certainly unpack them on future episodes of the podcast. So thanks again for coming on the show, Jackson. If you guys are enjoying the show, you want more like this, you have your own philosophic questions, you can email me at john@theobjectivestandard.com, John, Jon, @theobjectivestandard.com. And make sure to give us a like, give us a rating, subscribe. All these are dependent on where you're listening to this. And, until next time, happy flourishing.